Kia ora whānau, how's it going? It's a way to go here. Hey, welcome back to Word on Monday. Just doing a little reflection on the first chapter of Isaiah, verses 17, and it's in the context of how one might become familiar with the rituals and routines of faith. And it becomes a religious organization or systems, and how in the midst of our familiarity with how we do things and express our organization, where it can be at a predicament where we lose sight of our original purpose. And so in Isaiah chapter 1 verse 17, you have these words, and I read, "Learn to do right, seek justice, encourage the oppressed, defend the cause of the fatherless, and plead the case of the widow." Just to set a bit of context, we're in the first chapter of a series of books and chapters that follow of Isaiah and the prophets, and often alongside the work of the kings of Israel and Judah, and later after the exile and the return back to Jerusalem. You see the prophets speaking and warning and encouraging, and some of those might be weeping prophets. Some of those are prophets like Isaiah that talk about a time where if the people of God don't sort out their own stuff, they will go into exile. And so you see this ministry of both the king and the prophet, the people of God rising up, who are meant to be distinctly different from the nations around them, but yet also being a light to those nations. And it's a warning to us today that the Church of God is meant to be a critique to the world, but also meant to be a light to the world. This high image of salt and light. And sometimes we can get caught up in our own religious structures and processes and rituals that we actually lose sight of what we're really here for. And so, we find ourselves in a situation where, and rightfully so, there are critiques of the church in the world. There are people that are challenging what's going on in our society in relationship to the history of religion and faith and organisational side of things. But actually God was the first critic. He was the first one, and here right from the outset, he was tired of all the religious festivals and all the sacrificing of idols and all these external activities to make you look like you're in the right group or the people of God, but their hearts weren't in the right place. And part of the demonstration of that heart element is that faith and works were meant to work together. Now, don't get me wrong, and I mentioned this to our community here, our works do not give us salvation. They do not earn our place into heaven. We are totally deprived of anything in ourselves that can make us right before God. That's only the work of King Jesus. Jesus is the one who enables us to come before the throne of grace without guilt or shame. It's through the blood. Hebrews talks about the blood as it speaks greater things than the blood of Abel. It speaks for righteousness, it speaks for reconciliation, it speaks for holiness. But if we don't heed the words of like Isaiah, and later on when Jesus in Luke chapter 4, where he speaks, we can fall down a trap and create a religious thing. And as I read out here, what God really desires is is a heart that has a heart for what he sees and he does. And so in our being together, in our worshiping, in our reading of the word, in our activities of those religious rituals that we do, if they're not followed up by actions that demonstrate the love of God to our communities, to our families, to our kāinga, then they're just religion. And God hates religion. You just need to read the Bible. You need to read and see the scriptures. He's always talking about our right relationship with him. Our forms, our sacrifices, our piety, our gowns, our liturgy, they're not things that he finds satisfaction in. He finds satisfaction in someone's heart that is circumcised for him and starts to reflect. And here in Isaiah, right from the outset, even before Isaiah's encounter with that heavenly vision, God is revealing the type of heart that he wants his people to have, both individually and as a community. He wants people who have a heart for things that are right. We're living in a world that's turning everything upside down. What was once right has now become wrong, and what was wrong is becoming right. And so by the world standards, everything has been tossed around and thrown upside down, and you don't know what's right here. There's no more absolutes. I beg to differ, and that's where we come to the scriptures. We come to the scriptures in its totality and all that it talks about in relationship to the desire that God wishes to have with humanity, to have with people. And it's about restoring relationships. There's a restoration that God is doing through Christ Jesus to restore us. Part of the physical and demonstrative evidence of that restoration that's happening in a church community or in a family community or in a hapu or a whānau is that you start to demonstrate and reflect the heart of God. And so the first part there is about doing things that are right, seeking right, things that are right, seeking justice. Now, this is not something that's just for yourself or seeking justice for your own harm that may have come against you. It's for the other person. It's for other people. That through our employment engagements, that they're done in a just way. Through our way we talk to people, that it's done in a just way. Through the way that we develop economic streams and or the economic cycle and how that's moved around our communities. People are paid for what they offer and for what they do in relationship to entrepreneurial things. Many years back I came across Robert Kiyosaki's work around about the cash flow quadrant and the schema around the freedom that comes from wealth and the wealth creation is not being an employee. If you're tied to an employee system, you're always going to be poor. You're always going to be wanting a pay rise and so forth. So we here in our town and our community wanting to encourage people in that entrepreneurial thing to find something that they can create and to offer to someone else, whether it's food or kai or artwork or ways of relaxing, ways of enjoying the creation. It's the ability to create stuff. And sure, we need to stand up for places where there's outright abuse in relationship to power and authority, whether it's a justice system, whether it's a policing system, an education system, whether it's our homes, our kāinga, whether it's our tribal structures that are actually keeping us poor, whether it's the bureaucracy of the health system. We need to find ways of building resilience and building our capabilities to exercise our freedoms that God has given us. So we seek justice. We encourage the oppressed. We live in a community, in a town that's been marginalised by a lot of society, and so part of our role and part of our building community together is to find ways that we help those who are oppressed, that are on the edges and marginalised, rather than perpetuating the same thing, demonstrating ways of being different. I mentioned yesterday about farmers and gardeners and those who do fields, and the principle of leaving the edges of your fields for those who are less fortunate to be able to harvest from. This principle of if you have the means, to be mindful of those that are around us and how we can help them out. Defend the cause of the fatherless and plead the case of the widow. In the context of our scriptures, we find that they didn't have a social service system like we do have today. They didn't have structures where you might have a network of people that you can look after those that are fatherless or widow. There were strong tribal ties in these days of our scriptural reading, and you'll find this in most indigenous cultures. There are very strong tribal structures that hold the community together. But if you break those down, those who don't have fathers and those who are widowed tend to be the most vulnerable in our society. So you know, we're a product of our time today. We live in a society where there have been policies, there have been agendas where we've tried to break down the family unit, the mother, father, the children, and so forth. And there's been a real push to ostracize men, and particularly the father role within our homes. And as a result, we're seeing a lot of fatherless children out there. And so the call here from God to through Isaiah is to defend the cause of the fatherless, because there's a whole lot of things that come out of being fatherless. And you know, I'm a product of a fatherless home, and so I've had to find other men who can reflect and demonstrate healthy father habits, whether it's in my home, whether it's my relationship to my sons, whether it's relationship, how do I help my sons relate to other men and other women. How do we build community where there's this healthy dialogue, there's healthy engagement. There's a psychologist, Peterson, that's on YouTube, and he talks about the rough and tumble in the developmental process of boys in general, as well as girls, but predominantly with boys, and the need for the rough and tumble, the pillow fighting, and the skirmishing that you have to temper the ability of young men in knowing how to exert strength without it being hazardous. And one of the things that we used to do as a family when we were growing up is if we sensed our boys getting a little bit edgy, particularly in school terms, near the end of the school term, they'd seem to be a little bit distant, or they'd find themselves a little bit short in temperament, we would go, right, time for a sleep out. And so in a given weekend, we'd chuck all the mattresses down in the lounge before the fireplace if we're in Waiuru, and inevitably we would do roly-polies. And so I'd hold them together, and we'd just roll along the mattresses and roll along the back. And as they grew, obviously it became a bit harder. And I remember last time we did this, had Joshua in the middle, my two older boys. And as we're rolling around, I was going, I'm not going to be able to manage this anymore because they're just too big. But the principle behind that is that we learned how to do the rough and tumble in a way that helped the boys understand how they deal with things if they get hurt, but also how to deal with their temperaments and the emotional side of things. Know when they've got strength, but they don't necessarily need to use it. Now, if you're growing up in a fatherless society and where you've got no role models like that, you will go and find ways of being in those communities, or being in a group of people that can potentially demonstrate manhood, but in a way that may not necessarily be helpful or beneficial to our communities and society. So there's a call and a responsibility and a charge to the people of God here to defend the cause of the fatherless. In other words, step in the gap with them, and then plead the case for the widows. Those who in our communities, and they're all representative of people and places where we may have the ability to do something to support someone else. I use the imagery of a spectrum. Of at one end of the spectrum, it's green. In the middle, it might be yellow or amber, and then at the other end, it's red. And along that spectrum of life and experiences, we all tend to slide up and down it, depending on what our mental state's like, what our spiritual state is like, what our physical state's like, and what our wairua state's like. One of the key nuances to that fluctuation is that it's the wairua that holds it all together. We think it's our mental or our physical ability, but it's actually the wairua. The wairua is the barometer that holds it all together, to making sure that it's fine. So, one day we might be down in the fields and looking at the daisies and or the sky, or in the bush and the ngahere, and just smelling and hearing the birds, and there's just tau. We're at peace. And then, you start walking and going through a season where all of a sudden, you've gradually moved down to where it's in the red phase, and it's like winter. You feel numb and exhausted and tired and lonely and questioning everything that's going on in your life and everything else in between. An observation of this verse is that we're to be mindful of people around us. Because sometimes when we're sitting in the green and ember phase of our lives, that everything's going well, we can become quite self-focused in relationship to everything's fine and dandy. But we also need to be mindful that there are people in our community that may be heading towards the red or coming back out of it. And in our faith journeys, what God is saying here, and we'll pick up some other verses soon, is that our faith needs to have actions to it. It's not enough just to come to church. It's not enough just to be part of a worship team or run the children's church or do things internally. We're challenged to look outwardly. We're challenged to be mindful of those that are less fortunate, and consider how we may help them in their journey. Because if we're honest, we all slide up and down the spectrum. I don't know any time of a given year where I'm in a green space, and I might be yellow, and then I'm red, and then green, and it just moves up and down. And you need to build friends and community around you, where you have trusted people that you're able to talk to in any of those phases. And if you're in a green space at the moment, that you're well and that everything's going good, call someone up that you might know that might be somewhere in the ember phase, or might be moving into red, or stuck in a red, or on the extreme side of the red. Give them a call and say, how are you going? And listen to what they say and what they do, and never know that listening may actually help them come back into a more balanced and toe side of things. Jesus in Luke chapter 4, he says these things, and this is really a layering on the Isaiah 1:17 passage, but he says this: as he returns back to Galilee, he goes into the temple and opens up the scroll of the prophet Isaiah. And as he's unrolling it, he reads these words: "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he's anointed me to preach the good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and the recovery of sight to the blind, to release the oppressed. So here's another layer. Here's another layer of the activities of King Jesus, is that alongside the Isaiah passage where there's a call to the church or call to the people of Israel who's been set apart to be a light to the nations around us. So too here Jesus is modelling the same motif. Later on Jesus talks about, I haven't come for those who are well, it's those who are sick, those who are willing to say they're in need of him. And so this imagery of those who are less fortunate, the poor, those who are bound, some of the, when we were doing prison ministry down in Mount Eden and Paremunimu, there are people that were more free in prison than those who are around the streets in our town. Those who are bound, those who are blind. It's those that are marginalised, those that are bound up by the way society is, that God's got a heart for. And then later on, Revelation, the messages to the church, here's Jesus speaking to the 7 churches, and there's this recurring theme. I know your works. I know your works. In chapter 2 onwards, there's these consistent themes of Jesus speaking to the churches and saying, actually, what you do is important. Your actions are important. And there's that call to move away from the religious. And so, yep, the world reacts towards it, and rightfully so, because God does too. God hates religion. He'll spew it out. He will judge it, because he's calling us to be a people of faith, a people, a community that love each other and demonstrate that love towards each other and the society around us. So in my kōrero today, God hates religion, but he loves people. And his heart is for those that are less fortunate, those in our society that struggle, and there's a role that you and I can play. I mentioned that all of us have gifts and talents. Every single one. God has planted a gift and a talent in you, and you have the ability to utilize that to help someone. If you're in the red state at the moment, and the black dog is chasing you and you're trying to get out of it, the vampire is sucking life out of you, call someone up. Call up the helpline. Make contact with your doctor. If you're in that red state and you're struggling with where you're at and you're feeling that the winter is long and cold, find your combat buddy. Find a community or someone that you can talk to and just unload and talk to and just share what's going on. Connect. One of the big signs around why depression and the depth of it happens is people are disconnected. We're coming out of a season where there's this whole thing about being safe is that we've used a principle of isolation. Isolation causes mental health problems, and so we need to find ways of how do we reconnect together, how do we build relationships together as a first step. So get a hold of someone. If you're sliding down into green or going up into yellow, think about how you might find ways of connecting with others and just sharing with them. The pressure may not be as great at the moment, but it's still important that you do connect and do find ways. And if you're in the yellow pastures or in the green field, if someone calls you and needs help, take time to listen. Take time to reach out to them and listen. Active listening skills. Listen to how they're going, and be mindful of others that are around us in our community. A healthy person, a healthy man, a healthy woman, a healthy child, a boy or girl, comes with us being in community together. The world tells us to be isolated. The world tells us to be broken and separate and do your own thing. but actually taking a time to step back and be part of the community, our kāinga, our hapu, our whānau, wherever we're at, is one of the first steps to being healthy, is building relationships with each other and maintaining those. Hoi ana whānau, he kōrero poto tēnei mā tātou. I pray that this has been helpful. Click the like button and share with anyone that might be having a tough time at the moment. Let's build faith. People of faith, people of community where we're encouraging each other in our faith journeys. So Lord bless you and keep you. May his face continue to shine upon you this week. And until next time, God bless.